Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our opening C21 event for the spring semester. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Eric Goldschmidt. I'm the new director of the Church in the 21st Century Center, and I'm really thrilled and excited to be part of such a wonderful endeavor here at Boston College. As many of you have known, the C21 Center has been a catalyst and resource for the renewal of the Catholic Church since 2002 in response to the sexual abuse crisis. The C21 Center explores topics related to four focal issues: handing on the faith, the Catholic intellectual tradition, relationships and sexuality in the Catholic teachings, and the role and responsibilities of laity, religious, and the ordained. This semester's theme is Catholics as Sacramental People, which you've seen as our magazine issue. It's also the topic for this evening's event. Father John Baldwin is the editor of this, and David Turnblom, a theology doctoral student, was a wonderful help in putting together this valuable resource. We have extra copies in the back if you have not received one. You'll also see in the magazine our list of events for the semester. You might notice that Father Baldwin is speaking next Thursday at 5:30 in the Heights Room. His talk is entitled, Why Be Baptized in the Catholic Church? Tonight's speaker, whom obviously many of you know and love, will talk for about 30 minutes, followed by brief questions and answers. And we've asked John Kelly to introduce Father Himes this evening. And John Kelly is originally from Atlanta, Georgia. He's a senior in the Carroll School of Management, double majoring in theology and accounting. John has been serving the C21 Student Advisory Board since his freshman year, and he's also served as a student representative on the C21 Advisory Committee for the past 2 years. His contributions on campus as a young Catholic leader are quite impressive. John took Father Himes' class, The Belief in Modernity, last semester, and knowing that Father Himes encourages us all to hand on the faith, it's only fitting that we ask a student of Father Himes to introduce him this evening. Please welcome John Kelly.
Hey everyone, thank you again for coming out this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce to you all Father Michael Himes. Father Himes was ordained a priest in Brooklyn, New York in 1972. He received a PhD from the University of Chicago and held the position of Dean of Studies at the seminary in Macklin, New York. He has been a professor of theology at Notre Dame and is now a professor of theology at Boston College. Last year, I had the great experience of taking a class with Father Himes. As many of you can attest, his lectures not only challenge your faith, but are an inspiration to develop a stronger relationship with God. So now would you all please join me in welcoming Father Michael Himes.
Thank you so much for being here this evening. I'm honored by your presence. I cannot resist remarking that the evening is already a success as far as I'm concerned, because when I arrived, Eric reminded me that the last time we were together, we were sipping wine in Paris. I could live off that memory for the whole rest of the evening. My topic for this evening is why we are a sacramental people. And the answer to it can be given very simply, because the whole universe is a sacramental universe. Now, what does that mean? That's what we want to take apart. I'm going to suggest to you that ultimately where we're going with this is to say that everything is incipiently, everything is possibly sacramental. Some things, for example, 7 key ceremonies, 7 key moments of the life of the church, are explicitly sacramental, but everything is implicitly sacramental. Why? Well, I'm going to ask you to think with me about a question first, a huge question, an immense question, a question that's been debated for centuries and has been waiting for this evening to be resolved. And I'm going to do it. And that question is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe exist? Why the Big Bang and not the Great Silence? Why is there anything? And the answer I suggest to you is because God loves it. You see, there are many possible ways you could answer it. Different people have answered it. Some very distinguished theologians have answered it by saying, it's to show the glory of God. It's to reveal the power and the justice of God. All of those are wonderful things, and I'm in favor of all of them. But they're not actually the reason why there's something rather than nothing. Because you see, all of them imply that God is getting something out of creating. That God becomes glorified. God is seen to be just. God is manifested in his works. But that all implies that the universe is doing something for or to God. And of course, you can't do something for or to God. God doesn't need the universe. God, you remember, is God. God doesn't need anything. God is perfect, complete, full, absolute. Well, if the universe doesn't exist so that God gives something to it, is it possible that the universe exists so that God can give something to it? It's not that the universe gives something to God, but that God gives something to the universe. Now, what is it that God calls the whole universe into being in order to give? Well, again, there are two possibilities I suggest to you. The first is that the universe is called into being so God can give it something other than God. Something very good, something very wonderful, but not God's self. But the problem with that is anything that exists that isn't God is just more of the universe. So it doesn't really answer the question. The only possibility I suggest to you that really holds up is God calls everything into existence so God can give God's self to it. The universe exists so that God can give God's self to the universe. The universe exists so that because God loves it. Now, I want you to think about that with me for a moment, because it's perfectly easy to say yes to it, nod our heads, without recognizing the immense implications of that. Please notice, I'm not saying everyone. I'm not saying that God loves every human being. I am saying that, but I'm saying a lot more than that. I'm saying God loves every single creature. You, me, the chair you're sitting on, your pet cat, your favorite rhododendron, a little crustacean scuttling across the Marianas Trench in the Pacific at this moment, a pebble on the third moon of the planet Neptune. Everything that exists because God loves it. Everything is resting on the love of God. Is there a name for that love of God, God's self-gift, outside the Trinity, that which brings the universe into existence? There is. There's a bit of theological shorthand which has been around for a very long time. The shorthand is grace. That's what we mean by the word grace. Grace is simply theological shorthand for God's gift of God's self outside the Trinity, beyond, as it were, the Trinity. Now, if you think about that for a moment, what we're saying is everything that exists, absolutely everything that exists because God loves it. That's an extraordinary claim. But that's absolutely at the center of the whole of the Christian, certainly of the whole Catholic Christian tradition. Everything that exists because God loves it into being and holds it in being by his love at this very moment. I might point out just in passing, that's ultimately the ground of our hope. I sometimes think that we talk about the possibility of being held in existence, of the immortality, our immortality, as being the result of some ingredient in us that we call the soul. And after this case decays away, the soul goes on ticking along because it's created to be immortal. I personally don't think that's what Christianity is about at all. I think what Christianity is saying is, yes, indeed, we are held in being. We don't die, but the reason we don't die is not because there's something in me that can't die that we call the soul. It's because God is so wildly in love with Michael Himes that God won't face eternity without me. That God loves all God's creatures so totally that God holds those creatures in being. But it's God's active love that holds us in being, not some ingredient in me. It's not that I've got an immortal soul, it's that God's got an immortal love. And that love is directed toward me and you and everything that exists. That is absolutely fundamental to the whole of the Christian tradition. And it leads me finally to what I want to say to you about sacraments. This is what I like to refer to as the sacramental principle. It's been defined in a number of ways over the course of centuries. This is my handy-dandy definition of the sacramental principle. For purposes of this evening, we'll refer to it as the truth. The sacramental principle holds that what is always and everywhere true must be noticed, accepted, and celebrated somewhere, sometime. That's the sacramental principle. If something is always and everywhere true, if there's something that's always the case, it will be ignored. Think of the things that are always present to us and how easily we ignore them. Think of, for example, your heart beating. You don't pay attention to your heart beating most of the time. It's only if something goes wrong and your heart starts beating irregularly that you may notice it. Otherwise, we just take it for granted. Think about blinking. Since I've started talking, you've all been sitting there blinking. I hope you haven't been counting the blinks, or this has been preternaturally dull. But you don't notice the blinks unless something calls our attention to it. A number of years ago now, I was struck by a bout of Bell's palsy, and everything on the left side of my face froze, including the ability to blink. I had to tape my eyes shut at night, and in the course of the day, I had to remember periodically to reach up and hold the lid down to keep the eyeball moist. By the way, it's a terrible affliction for theologians who, by definition, speak out of both sides of their mouths. It meant that I could only speak out of one. You don't think about blinking until something calls your attention to it. You don't pay any attention to the oxygen in a room until the oxygen gets to be stale. That which is always and everywhere present is easily ignored. If we're going to really attend to something that is always and everywhere present, it needs to be celebrated and noticed somewhere, sometime. Think, for example, of celebrating someone's birthday. The mic just went on. It's a shame because the first part of the talk was the meaning of life, and you've all missed it in the second half of the room. Think of celebrating someone's birthday. We say to them on their birthday that we love them, that we care about them, that they mean a great deal to us. That's certainly not because the other 364 days of the year we couldn't care less about them, but on this one day every year we really care about them. The point is, it's because we always care about you that sometime we have to let you know that. We have to tell you it. We have to pay attention to the fact. Well, that's the principle of sacramentality. What is always and everywhere true must be noticed, accepted, and celebrated somewhere, sometime. And you notice what I've suggested to you so far is that that which is always and everywhere true, constantly, what is always present, everywhere present, what we never get away from, is the absolute self-gift of God, is God's love, which means that God's love can easily be overlooked unless somewhere, sometime, we notice it, accept it, and celebrate it. Those occasions that get us to notice, accept, and celebrate the love of God, which is always present in our lives. Any person, place, thing, or event, any sight, sound, taste, touch, or smell that causes you to notice, say yes to, accept, embrace, and celebrate the love of God, that's what we mean by a sacrament. How many sacraments are there, therefore? How many things exist in the universe? Anything and everything can be a sacrament. There are the 7 great communal sacraments, to be sure, but they're only the great communal instances of something much, much more embracing. Everything that we encounter can be a sacrament. The most obvious example of that is, all of you who are married, I sincerely hope that high on your list of sacraments is your spouse. Now, your spouse is not someone I know. They may not be a sacrament for me at all, but I trust they're an enormously important sacrament for you. That they're a constant reminder to you of the reality of God's love in your life. Think about your children or grandchildren. I don't know them, and their next-door neighbors may simply think of them as those noisy kids next door. But to you, they're profoundly sacramental. You can't see a picture, you can't hear the voice of your grandchild or your child on the phone without immediately, on some level, being aware of, this is a good universe. This is the love of God. This is absolute love being experienced here in the concrete. We all have our own personal sacraments, and then there are the great public sacraments, the communal sacraments, for example, the great 7. But sacramentality is a much wider and more important principle. If that's true, then how do sacraments remind us how do they bring us to see the love of God? Well, that goes back to a statement that comes from St. Augustine, which St. Thomas Aquinas quotes endlessly. Every time Thomas takes up sacraments, he quotes this line from Augustine. Every time that I know of that he takes up sacraments, he always uses this line. Augustine had written 800 years before Thomas that sacraments, quote, effect what they signify. That is to say, they cause something that they signify, something that they, as it were, point at. Well, I want to take that very seriously. Sacraments effect. They bring us to recognize the presence of grace by pointing. What precisely do they point at? Well, this is the key. They point not out, but first of all, in. You see, the point about a sacrament is not that it's a sign that gets us to think about something else. Like, for example, we see a red octagon and we think, better put my foot on the brake. There's no immediate or direct connection between the red octagon and my slowing the car. That's a sign. It's pointing to something outside itself. But think what happens when you walk into a room and there is someone who is a very dear friend of yours who greets you with a warm smile and an embrace. Is that a reminder of the fact that they love you, or is that the very embodiment of the fact that they love you? It's not pointing outside to something, it's pointing inside itself to what makes it to be real at all. That's how sacraments function. They don't point out, they point in. They bring us to recognize what is always true in them. And because it is true of them, we begin to recognize it may be true of anything. The most beautiful statement of this that I know of anywhere in the English language is from Gerard Manley Hopkins. Whenever I talk about sacraments, I quote this, as, for example, I just said Thomas always quotes Augustine. Well, I always quote Hopkins on this. It's in a poem that I suspect almost all of you have run across because it's one of the most often anthologized of Hopkins's poems. It's entitled it actually goes by its first line. And what he says in the poem is this. What he's describing is walking home. I think it's walking home from the school where he was teaching at the time to the Jesuit residence where he was living. And it's the fall of the year. And the fall of the year in the British Isles, as you know, means that things are even a little foggier, a little wetter, and a little grayer than they were in the spring of the year. And so as Hopkins is walking home, he's lamenting the fact that the summer is gone, winter is coming, and he's not looking forward to it at all. And suddenly he finds himself noticing, look at the foliage, look at the way the leaves are changing colors. Look at the joy of people out in the fields bringing in the harvest. Look at the way the clouds scud by at this time of year with the wind off the sea. And he realizes This didn't change at that moment. It wasn't something that happened as he stood there. That had already been there. The leaves had already begun changing colors. The joy of the harvest was underway. It's just that he hadn't noticed it. And when he notices it, it leads him to say, why have I been worrying about the summer that's gone and the winter that isn't here and ignoring the one thing that is here, namely the autumn, the fall, the harvest time? Hurrahing in harvest, as the poem begins, as the title says, saying hurrah in the fall season. And it leads him in the next to the last line of the poem to give what I think is the most beautiful statement of the sacramental principle in the English language. Hopkins says, these things were here, and but the beholder wanting. The beauty of the foliage, the loveliness of the fall, it was already here. Hopkins hasn't brought it, it's here. It was here all along. What has changed on his walk home? Hopkins has changed, not the world around him. It's not that now the world is beautiful, before it wasn't. It was always beautiful. It's just that Hopkins wasn't looking at it. What's changed is Hopkins. That is the heart of the sacramental principle. Everything is sacramental. Everything is revealing in its own depths. If we could see everything that exists, if we could see anything that exists in its deepest depths, we would see it as held in being at that moment by God's love. It's the only reason there is something rather than nothing. It's an enormous explosion of the love of God. And if we could see, if we could really attend to one thing clearly enough, closely enough, that we see it for what it is at its depths, we would be seeing grace. We would be seeing the love of God which holds all things in being. It's we who have to change, not the world. The world is already engraced. We just don't notice it. We need to be more attentive sacramentally. This is why in the Church's liturgy, as I like to say often about the liturgy, it's the principle of Roman Catholic liturgy is everything in the kitchen sink. I mean, what do you like? Are you particularly sensitive to color? Good. We put paintings up, mosaics, we have stained glass. Do you like music? We've got all kinds. We've got organ music and orchestral music. We've got folk music and we've got Gregorian chant. We've got the great masses of Haydn and Mozart. We've got all sorts of wonderful music. Do you like something, a strong sense of taste? We give you something to drink and we give you something to eat. We pour oil on you. We put you to bed when you get married. We impose hands on you when we appoint you to office. Do you like incense? Do you like strong sense of smell? We'll wave incense at you. We wave banners, we wear vestments, we change colors, we parade in and out. Everything is fair game. Because you see, the whole thing is engraced. It isn't that there is anything that you could say, oh no, that can't work in the liturgy. That's secular. There's nothing that's secular. If by secular you mean unloved, ungraced, non-religious, the whole thing is engraced. It's engraced from beginning to end, from top to bottom. It just needs somebody to notice it. And sacraments are those occasions that get us to notice what is always and everywhere the case. That's why we are a sacramental people. We're a sacramental people because what else could you possibly be? If that's what the universe is like, then we are the people who are called to notice it. And we do it by reverencing it. Everything deserves that reverence. The attention to what is, to genuinely see what is there, to notice what's important, to see what is present, to actually see it for what it is to see it as engraced. A favorite story of mine. Back in 1901, all the way back at the beginning of the 20th century, a very distinguished Catholic lay scholar named Friedrich von Hugel, who despite the German name was in fact an Englishman, was invited to give a talk to a student group at Oxford. And in the course of his address to them, von Hugel raised a rhetorical question. He asked these presumably rather serious young men, and they would have been young men at the time at Oxford, no young women, sadly enough. Oxford has gotten a lot pleasanter in the intervening 100 years. That he asked them the rhetorical question, who, in their opinion, was the model of asceticism of discipline, self-discipline in the spiritual life in the century that had just ended, the 19th century. And they undoubtedly thought of all sorts of impressive religious figures, but I think they must have been shocked by the answer that von Hugel gave to his own question. Von Hugel said to them that he thought the greatest example of spiritual discipline in the 19th century was Charles Darwin. Because he said here was a man of obviously extraordinary intelligence and energy who put all that intelligence and energy, he subordinated it all to the painstakingly careful examination of the varieties of barnacles and the beaks of pigeons. That Darwin insisted that you see what's there to be seen. And von Hugel said that was the heart of spiritual discipline. I think that's true. The real heart of asceticism, of a disciplined spiritual life, is not somehow knocking oneself around. This is rather important to say, I think, just before the start of Lent next week. It's not about knocking ourselves around as if God gets delight out of seeing his creatures beat themselves up, deprive themselves of things they like to eat, refuse to do things that they find very pleasant. That's not what God is interested in. That's not God. That's Caligula. It turns God into some sort of bizarre sadomasochist. The real point of spiritual discipline is that you stop looking in the mirror long enough that you might possibly start looking out the window. That instead of concentrating on oneself all the time, one look at others, one see what's there, one attend to what's there to be noticed. That's the heart of sacramentality, and that's the heart of the spiritual life, I think. Because if you see what's there to be seen, what you're also seeing is the absolute love of God. So, as we continue in this spring term with the question, why are we a sacramental people? There's a very simple answer, and I'm giving it to you now before everyone else does this term. And the simple answer is, what else could we possibly be? Thank you very much.